"You're not immediate family anymore, Mom." My daughter said it so casually that for a moment I thought I must have misheard her. We were sitting around her polished oak dining table on a quiet Sunday evening in late November, the kind of night when the air outside already smelled like winter and people in our town were starting to put up Christmas lights. The room went strangely still after she said it. My daughter Emily kept cutting her chicken as if nothing unusual had happened, and her husband Daniel stared at his plate like the words floating in the air were completely normal. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at her across the table, noticing how confident she seemed, like someone who had already made up her mind about something important. "It's just how we're organizing things now," she added, finally glancing up. "Immediate family only for certain events." I nodded slowly, as if I understood. At 68, I've learned that silence often tells you more than questions ever could. I folded my napkin carefully, placed it beside my plate, and gave Emily a small smile. What she didn't realize in that moment was that a single sentence can reveal everything about a person, and sometimes it also gives you the clarity you need to decide exactly what comes next. I drove home that night through quiet streets lined with bare trees and early holiday lights, the kind that blinks softly in red and white across front porches and mailbox posts. My house sat at the end of a small cul-de-sac, the same place where Emily learned to ride her bicycle nearly 30 years ago. When I stepped inside, the silence felt different than usual, heavier somehow. I hung my coat by the door and walked slowly through the living room where the old grandfather clock ticked steadily against the wall. My late husband Thomas used to wind that clock every Sunday morning before church, saying a house should always have something that keeps time honestly. Late during science fair projects, believing that family means something permanent. Yet that evening at the dinner table, Emily had said those words as if they were simple household rules, like deciding who sits where at Thanksgiving. I sat down in the kitchen with a cup of tea and stared at the quiet room, realizing that sometimes the most important changes in life begin not with shouting, but with a single calm sentence spoken across a dinner table. I did not sleep much that night. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the old clock in the living room and the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Around 2 in the morning, I finally stood up and walked slowly through the hallway, passing the framed photographs that had been hanging there for years. Emily at 7 years old holding a blue ribbon from the county fair. Emily at 16 standing beside her first car, a used silver sedan that Thomas and I saved for nearly a year to buy. And then Emily in her wedding dress, smiling brightly on a warm June afternoon in the church where her father and I had once exchanged our own vows. I stood there longer than I expected, studying that picture. Daniel had his arm around her shoulders, looking proud and confident, the way young couples often do when they believe the future belongs entirely to them. Back then I remember feeling relieved, even grateful, thinking my daughter had found someone who would build a good life beside her. Yet over the past few years small things had begun to change. Fewer phone calls, holidays that somehow became complicated, invitations that arrived late or not at all. At the time I told myself it was simply adulthood, busy schedules, the normal distance that grows when children start their own families. Once, and then everything went quiet again. It was the kind of ordinary morning that usually feels peaceful, but that day my mind kept returning to the dinner table and the calm way Emily had spoken. The more I thought about it, the more certain details from the past few months began lining up in my memory like pieces of a puzzle. The time Daniel casually asked whether I had updated the paperwork on the house after Thomas passed away. The afternoon Emily suggested that managing a place this size must be difficult for someone my age. At the time she said it with a gentle smile, the kind that sounds helpful on the surface. But now the words felt different when I replayed them in my head. I set the coffee cup down and looked around the kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals for my family. For the first time, a quiet realization settled in. Perhaps that conversation at dinner had not been spontaneous at all. Perhaps it had been the final step in a plan that had started long before I noticed it. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house slowly, noticing things I had ignored before. The sunlight coming through the kitchen window landed on the stack of mail near the counter, and as I sorted through it my eye stopped on a familiar name printed in the corner of one envelope. Jonathan Reed, my late husband's attorney. The letter had arrived 2 days earlier, but I had set it aside without opening it because the past few weeks had been filled with small responsibilities and quiet exhaustion. I carried the envelope to the dining table and sat down, running my finger along the edge of the paper for a moment before opening it carefully. The quiet sense that perhaps my husband had understood something long before I ever did. I waited 2 days before visiting Jonathan Reed's office, not because I was busy, but because I wanted my thoughts to settle first. His building stood on Main Street above a small insurance agency, the same place where Thomas and I had gone years earlier to finalize our estate documents. When I stepped inside, the familiar scent of old paper and polished wood immediately brought back memories of quieter times when planning the future felt like something distant and orderly. Jonathan greeted me with the same calm professionalism I remembered, though there was a careful seriousness in his expression that I did not overlook. We sat across from each other at his desk while he opened a slim folder and adjusted his glasses. He explained that several years before his passing, Thomas had updated certain legal instructions connected to the house and other financial matters. At the time, Jonathan said Thomas had insisted that the document remain sealed unless a particular situation made it necessary to review. Jonathan slid the folder across the desk toward me and folded his hands patiently. The paper inside was dated nearly 4 years ago, written in my husband's steady signature. As I read the first few lines, a quiet realization moved through me. Thomas had not simply organized our affairs. He had anticipated something. The office felt unusually quiet after I finished reading the document. I looked up at Jonathan Reed, and for a moment neither of us spoke. My husband's handwriting had always been steady and confident, and seeing it again on that page felt like hearing his voice after a long silence. The document explained that the house, the one Thomas and I had built our entire life around, would remain completely under my control unless I personally decided otherwise. No one could transfer it, sell it, or claim authority over it without my written consent. Jonathan explained that Thomas had insisted on very specific protections, even including instructions that certain financial decisions could be redirected to charitable foundations if pressure or manipulation ever became a concern. I closed the folder slowly, letting the weight of those words settle in my mind. Thomas had not been suspicious by nature, but he had always been observant. He noticed small changes in people, the subtle shifts in tone, and behavior that others often dismissed. Jonathan asked quietly whether everything at home was going well. I gave a small polite smile and thanked him for the document. As I walked back to my car under the pale afternoon sky, I felt something unusual settle inside me. It was not anger. It was clarity. And clarity, I have learned, can be a very powerful thing. I drove home slowly that afternoon, taking the longer road that winds past the small lake on the edge of town. The water was calm and gray under the cloudy sky, and for a moment I sat in the parked car watching the ripples move gently toward the shore. Thomas used to bring Emily here when she was little, teaching her how to skip stones across the surface, music playing in the background. Then Jonathan Reed arrived exactly as we had arranged earlier that week. His presence shifted the mood immediately. He greeted everyone politely before explaining, in his steady professional voice, that he needed to clarify several legal matters regarding Thomas's estate and the ownership of my home. The room grew quiet as he described the protections Thomas had placed years ago, ensuring that no one could make decisions about the property except me. I watched Emily's expression carefully as the realization settled in. When Jonathan finished speaking, I looked at my daughter calmly and said, very gently, that perhaps she had been right earlier. Families sometimes redefine who truly belongs. Then I thanked everyone for the evening and walked out into the cool night air feeling lighter than I had in a very long time.